exploring the intriguing topics of life from sports, food, and yes, politics, broadcasting from a semi-undisclosed location. Welcome to TobiasLand USA. Hello, my people, and welcome to TobiasLand USA, where any and every topic on this, the third rock from the sun, can be discussed. I am the mayor, county mayor, governor, president, prime minister, founding father, and or king of TobiasLand USA, Tobias DeBose, or just the host for short. And today actually begins the first of what's going to be a 4-part series. So at the time of this recording, it is July 22nd, 2026, and we are about a little more than a month away from the college football season. So for this and the following 3 episodes of this podcast, what I will be doing is doing four videos that do predictions for the upcoming football season in the SEC alone. Now, as I said in the prior video, this is still the beginning, so I'm just focusing on the SEC. There might be coming a day where I look at other conferences like the Big Ten, the ACC, the Big 12 possibly, but for this upcoming season, 2026, I'm just going to be focusing on the SEC for this year at least. So here's how things are going to work. So for episode 1, it's going to be, which is this one, it's going to be Alabama, Arkansas, Auburn, and Florida. Then part 2, it's going to be Georgia, Kentucky, LSU, and Mississippi State. For part 3, it's going to be Missouri, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. And for the 4th and final part, it's going to be Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Vanderbilt. So before I start giving out my predictions on each team, I just want to go over how I came up with these. So there were a few metrics I did look at for each of these. So the first one is based off of offense, the return of offensive production from last season, the return from defensive production from last season, and the strength of schedule FPI according to ESPN. So I will say in regards to the ESPN strength of schedule, each of the top 7 teams in ESPN's strength of schedule for 2026 were all from the SEC. The SEC also was able to hold down 9 of the top 10 spots and 15 of the top 16 spots. Additionally, as I go through over these, I just want to let you know that I'm just focusing on the regular season. So no SEC championship predictions, no college football playoffs, no postseason or anything like that. Although it is possible I do one for the college football playoffs as well as bowl season. But again, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So with all that out of the way as far as how I did each of these one by one, let's start now. So first up is my team, the Crimson Tide of Alabama. So heading into 2026, they finished dead last in the conference in offensive production from last season at 16th with 35% returning. They were tied for 7th in defensive production returning with 61%, and for their strength of schedule FPI rating by ESPN, they are ranked 15th. So for their first game of the season, Alabama plays Eastern Carolina at home. I think that's a win. They play at Kentucky the following week to open up SEC play. I think they should be able to handle that pretty simple because Kentucky is Kentucky, and they've pretty much been in a down slump the last couple of years under the last 2 years of Mark Stoops. Now, their next game is a non-conference. They play Florida State. Now, last year, Alabama lost by 2 touchdowns to Florida State in Tallahassee. This time, Alabama hosts Florida State in Tuscaloosa. I think they get their win back. I think they defeat Florida State. And then it's back into conference play for Alabama as they host South Carolina, a team that has given them fits and problems each of the prior 2 seasons. Both times, South Carolina barely beat Alabama, and in some way or another they should have beaten us, but they weren't able to. And I think that while I do think South Carolina will improve this season, I think it's going to be too much for them to overcome in Tuscaloosa this time. Give me Alabama in that one. Alabama plays at Mississippi State. They haven't lost to them since Nick Saban's first season in 2007. I don't see them losing this time on the road in Starkville. I think Alabama wins this one. And then on October 10th, Alabama hosts Georgia. It's been arguably the biggest rivalry in the SEC for the last few years, given the fact that the two teams involved, as it was the most dominant team in the SEC of the prior 15 to 20 seasons. Alabama versus the new cream of the crop, Georgia, so it's kind of like almost, this was sort of like a passing of the torch rivalry for Alabama, who was the best, now became Georgia, who's the best in this conference. Georgia, for whatever reason, Alabama has been Georgia's weakest, has been their Achilles heel for the last few seasons, because there are times where Georgia never lost to anyone in the regular season or even the entire season at all, except for Alabama, whether it be in conference championship games or in regular season games like last season, because in this decade, Georgia has only lost one game in this decade, the 2020s, at home, and that one home loss they had in this decade was last season against Alabama. And this time, they come back to Tuscaloosa, where they were able to come back after being down by about 20 or 28 points in 2024. Georgia came back, but Alabama was able to hold on to the victory, and I think they will get it done again. Alabama will. I think Georgia beats that one. Up next is a game I hold very near and dear to my heart. It's the Tennessee-Alabama game, the third Saturday in October in Knoxville. Fun fact about this: each of the last 5 home teams in this, the home team in this series has won each of the last 5 in this series. Alabama won in 21, 23, and 25 in Tuscaloosa, while Tennessee won in Knoxville in 22 and 24. And this is for this one in 2026. Tennessee hosts Alabama in Knoxville. It's going to be a track game. It's going to be close. I think it might seem close, but I think Alabama does cover whatever the score will be. I think Alabama wins handily, convincingly, and I think Alabama beats Tennessee to once again smoke another victory cigar. And now, finally, before their October 31st, which is Halloween open date, Alabama has to host a Texas A&M team. Texas A&M always plays Alabama competitively. It's always a fascinating rivalry that doesn't get talked about enough, especially the history with the former coaches, Alabama's former head coach Nick Saban, and then our former Jimbo Fisher, and the history that they had together, even though they're no longer there. It's still pretty interesting seeing those two match up. As a matter of fact, when Alabama lost to A&M, their first season in the conference, and when Nick Saban finally lost to a former assistant of his, it was when Alabama was ranked number 1, and they lost to unranked Texas A&M in College Station that night in 2021. But as far as 2026 goes, I think Texas A&M makes it close, but will be too much to overcome in Tuscaloosa. I like Alabama. So again, October 31st, Halloween, it's Alabama's off week, but they return on November 7th at LSU, which will probably be a night game. But even though probably a night game, I think Lane Kiffin will have his boys ready to play. Alabama wins handily, convincingly, and moves on to their game at Vanderbilt. Now, this is going to be a trap. I think this will be a trap game, even though Diego Pavia is no longer at Vanderbilt, and it's going to be a rebuild year for Clark Lee at Vandy. I think Alabama should not underestimate Vanderbilt. They did it before 2 years ago when they played in Nashville, and look what happened. But I think Alabama's learned their lesson, and I think Kalen DeBoer has got the boys inspired. I think they win. And then on November 21st, they play Chattanooga, an FCS opponent. They win convincingly, and they end their regular season against Auburn and Tuscaloosa for the annual Iron Bowl game. It's going to be. I think it'll be competitive. It might be a close finish like it was last year in Auburn, which was a game I was at. But I do believe that Alabama beats Auburn convincingly. So, just to recap one last time, I have Alabama with a win over at Eastern Carolina, Kentucky, Florida State, South Carolina, Mississippi State, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas A&M, LSU, Vanderbilt, Chattanooga, and Auburn to finish the season 12-0. Now up next is Arkansas. Arkansas is one of at least 6 head coaches in the SEC that will be first-year coaches. And they start their season November 5th against North Alabama, an FCS foe, who I do think they will defeat. However, the next week Arkansas does have to go on the road to Utah in the Big 12 for a non-conference matchup. I think they lose that one. I also think they lose to Georgia on September 19th at home in Fayetteville. And then their next game is going to be the 26th of September against Tulsa. I think might be a little closer, but I think Arkansas handles that easily. And then on October 3rd, it's going to be a matchup against former Southwest Conference foes, also known as the Southwest Classic, as Arkansas plays at Texas A&M. A&M wins in College Station, pretty simple. Now this next game to be played on October 10th is a fascinating one. For that one, they do play Tennessee. Now, between Arkansas and Tennessee is a much better team than Arkansas. So you would think that the nod would go to Tennessee. However, the reason why I'm picking Arkansas over Tennessee is because this game is being played in Fayetteville, not Knoxville, and in the post-Philip Fulmer era of Tennessee football. So from the 2009 season to now, Tennessee has only beaten Arkansas once in football, and that one victory was last season in Knoxville. But more on that when I cover Tennessee. But for 2026, I think Arkansas upsets Tennessee in Fayetteville. And then for the next game on October 17th, Arkansas plays at Vanderbilt in Nashville. I think both of them are going to be in the bottom half of the league when the season ends. But as far as a winner for this game, I'll take Vanderbilt because I think they have a returning head coach who has experience with the team, whereas Arkansas still has a first-year head coach. Which leads us to October 24th, their bye week, and which the Razorbacks return to on Halloween when they play their border rival Missouri in a game I think they will lose on the road in Columbia, Missouri. Then for the first weekend of November, they play at Auburn. I think that's also going to be a loss. And then on November 14th, they play South Carolina. That will also be a loss. With that loss being, again, South Carolina, who had a disappointing season last year, I think they will return. I don't see much of Arkansas for that game. I think South Carolina wins convincingly. And from one blowout loss to another on November 21st, I believe Arkansas will lose to Texas in Austin handily, as Texas will be one of the best teams in the SEC this upcoming season, heading into the college football playoffs, in my opinion. And lastly, for their final game on November 28th, for the first time since at least the 2013 season, Arkansas will end their season against LSU. And for the Battle of the Boot Trophy, it will be in Fayetteville, but with this being the first year of Lane Kiffin and all the guys he got in the transfer portal, I think LSU wins handily in Fayetteville. So just to recap the schedule for Arkansas, I got them winning against North Alabama, but losing to Utah, Georgia, winning against Tulsa, losing to Texas A&M, winning against Tennessee, losing to Vanderbilt, losing to Missouri, losing to Auburn, losing to South Carolina, losing to Texas, and losing to South Carolina to have a final 2026 record of 3 wins and 9 losses. Up next is Auburn. Auburn is another team that has a first-year head coach after firing former Ole Miss head coach Hugh Freeze before last season ended. They start their season against like Arkansas. Auburn will have a foe from the Big 12 Conference. This one being Baylor in a neutral site game in Atlanta. I think Auburn beats Baylor in no trouble whatsoever, as Baylor isn't really what they used to be. And then for the next game on September 12th, they host Southern Miss. No problems there. Auburn gets the win. Now Auburn plays Florida, another team who has a first-year head coach. More on him in a bit. But that game will be played in Auburn, not Gainesville. This was a toss-up for me, but for me, I had to go with Auburn now at home. Now again, this is in Gainesville. I probably would have picked Florida, but for this one, I'll go Auburn at home. Up next on September 26th, Auburn plays Vanderbilt, and I think Auburn takes care of Vanderbilt. They've barely lost to Auburn each of the last 2 seasons, or at least last season, to say the least. But I think Auburn finally gets it done against the Commodores. I think Auburn will beat Vanderbilt, and then on October 3rd, prior to their open date on October 10th, they play at Tennessee in Neyland, a renewed rivalry, which some younger fans may not know this, but for the longest time, one of Tennessee's biggest rivals was Auburn, because as a matter of fact, when talking of discussion of who's going to have a permanent opponent for these next 4 seasons in the 9-game schedule, at one point I suggested have Auburn and Tennessee play each other every season, because Tennessee had more history with Auburn than they did with Florida and Georgia, because Florida and Georgia never became Tennessee's rivals until the division split of 1992. But more on that when I talk about Tennessee and predict their season schedule. I think that Auburn gets their first loss of the season at Tennessee in Neyland Stadium in Knoxville. I think they lose that one to lose their first game of the season. They get an open date on October 10th in return for their rivalry against Georgia in the Deep South's oldest rivalry on October 17th in Athens. Last year's game was wild because there were so many in the last from the 2-minute warning of the second quarter until halftime. It lasted a full time of about 40 minutes. It got SEC officials and referees fired, or as they say, permanently suspended, because they kept reviewing over and over again. Plus, there was a questionable call to see if Auburn broke the plane, which that wasn't the issue. Whether or not I think that was whether or not the call wasn't the issue. It was more or less like how they went about it, as well as the fact they kept reviewing and reviewing over and over again, which is part of the reason why the time frame between 2 minutes and halftime was 40 minutes long. But anyways, Georgia wins. I think Georgia wins in a very tight battle. And then for the next game on October 24th, Auburn hosts LSU at Jordan-Hare Stadium with Lane Kiffin. Typically, the home team wins this one, but for this one, I'll go LSU because they have more experienced players on both sides of the ball than Auburn does. So LSU wins that one. And then on Halloween, which will likely be a light game, it's going to be a good old-fashioned SEC rivalry as Ole Miss hosts Auburn in Oxford. This one for me will be an Ole Miss win and an Auburn loss, simply because it's on the road, and Ole Miss will be fired up for this game because these two have a lot of history, an underrated history at that. It's not like, because those two teams, for whatever reason, the history that Auburn and Ole Miss has with each other is underrated by some of their other big rivals like LSU and Alabama, because Auburn has history with LSU and Alabama, but so does Ole Miss. Their two common rivals, LSU and Alabama, because of those mutual rivalries they have with those two teams, the rivalry they had with each other between Ole Miss and Auburn doesn't really get brought up enough when it really should. But for this rivalry between Auburn and Ole Miss, I have Ole Miss winning on October 31st, Halloween, in Oxford. The next week, Auburn finally gets back to its winning ways as they play a weekend Arkansas team on November 11th in Auburn. I think they win that one. And they play at a very weak Mississippi State team in Starkville, November 14th. They win that one. November 21st, they play Samford, an FCS team. They win handily, and then end their season at Alabama in Tuscaloosa for the annual Iron Bowl. This one, I think, will be another fun, exciting one. I think Alabama might pull away, but I think it will be, as usual, a close victory for Alabama. So I think LSU loses that one. So to recap for Auburn, I have them winning against Baylor, Southern Miss, Florida, and Vanderbilt, then losing to Tennessee, Georgia, LSU, and Ole Miss, then turning things around, winning 3 straight against Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Samford, and losing their regular season finale against Alabama in the Iron Bowl to finish the season with a record of to finish the season with a record of 7 wins and 5 losses. Now, for the last team I want to talk about in this video is going to be Florida. So, Florida has also, like Arkansas and Auburn, Florida has a new head coach this season, and it all begins with them hosting Florida Atlantic in Gainesville on September 5th. I think Florida wins that one handily. Then the next week on the 12th of September, they play Campbell, an FCS team. They win that one. November 19th, they get their first loss of the season when they play at Auburn. As I said earlier, I think the home team of that one is going to win because it could go either way. But I got Auburn winning that one. And then on September 26th, on September 26th, Ole Miss comes to town in Gainesville, and they pick up and Florida gets a win over Ole Miss. Now, Florida doesn't really play Ole Miss, but if you look at the schedule, something interesting always happens when those two play each other, Florida and Ole Miss. And I think it will be another one in which Florida gets the victory in that matchup. And then as we go into the month of October, they start off October with a road trip to Columbia, Missouri, as they take on the Missouri Tigers in what I think will be a last-minute win against the Missouri Tigers. And then the following week on October 10th, they host South Carolina, a very much improved South Carolina team. I think South Carolina loses to Florida. Florida loses South Carolina, and then their losing streak continues the next week on October 17th when Florida has to travel to Austin, Texas to take on the Longhorns in what I believe will be another loss for the Florida Gators as Texas gets the victory. Fortunately for Florida, they do get a bye on October 24th, but then return to action on Halloween, October 31st, as they take on their state line rival Georgia in the world's largest cocktail party. This being the first of 2 matchups to not take place in Jacksonville for the first time since the 90s. As this matchup, they play Georgia in Atlanta, and the following year they'll play each other next year somewhere in Florida. But for this matchup in 2026, Georgia wins convincingly in Atlanta, and which is going to be essentially a semi-home game for Georgia. The following week, on November 7th, they host Oklahoma, an Oklahoma team that I think will have made some improvements, and I think Oklahoma gets the road victory in Gainesville. Then on November 14th, Florida plays at Kentucky. This Kentucky-Florida game rivalry is another rivalry that doesn't really get brought up much because for the longest time, because Florida won for about 130 straight up until 2018, where they lost to Kentucky in Gainesville. And while they did win the following 2 in 1920, Kentucky then won 3 straight in 21, 22, and 23 before. So Kentucky kind of sort of has made this rivalry an even playing field whenever those two teams play each other. But I think that even though it's going to be in Lexington, Kentucky, in the middle of November, and it's likely going to be a night game, I think somehow or another Florida will get the victory in that matchup. Then the following week, their penultimate game of the regular season. Florida hosts Vanderbilt, who will be taking a few steps back from last season, and will win that game. They will win in Gainesville. Florida will over Vanderbilt. And lastly, they end their season against their non-conference rival Florida State in Tallahassee. Florida State, I don't think they will improve, but I don't think enough to then make a big impact. I think they will lose their second SEC game, their second game against an SEC foe, first against Alabama on September 19th, and the second one being November 28th against Florida. So I do think Florida wins that one. So just to recap, I have Florida winning against Florida Atlantic and Campbell before losing at Auburn, and then winning against Ole Miss at home, then winning at Missouri in Columbia before losing to South Carolina at home, then at Texas, then against Georgia in Atlanta, then losing against Oklahoma and Gainesville, before winning at Kentucky, winning at home against Vanderbilt, and winning at Florida State to have a final regular season record of 7 wins and 5 losses. So those are the first 4 matchups. So those are the first 4 SEC teams I've predicted to go where they go and finish where they will in the regular season. And to recap one more time, where each team ranked: Alabama finished 16th in offensive production returning, 16th with 35% returning. For defensive production returning, they're tied 7th with 61%, and their strength of schedule, according to ESPN, being 15th in the nation. For Arkansas, they are actually tied 11th and 55% in both returning offensive production and returning defensive production. They're both tied at 11th at 55%, with their strength of schedule, according to ESPN, being number 1 in the entire country, not just the SEC, but the entire nation. For Auburn is ranked 10th for both returning offensive production and returning defensive production. The offensive production being 56% returning, and the defense being 58% returning, with an ESPN strength of schedule record being 13th. Finally, for Florida, they are tied for 11th with 55% of offensive production returning in 2026. However, they are first in the SEC in defensive production returning in 2026, and their strength of schedule record in the nation, according to ESPN, is 7th. So that's the first part in this 4-part series as I make my predictions for the upcoming SEC season. So share your thoughts on what you think will happen for these 4 teams, and stay tuned for the next few weeks as I release the remaining predictions for the remaining 12 teams in the SEC. So until next time, this is Tobias saying take care of yourself and each other, and remember, peace, love, understanding, a stogie, and a nice cold beer is what will save the world. You've been listening to the TobiasLand USA podcast, a production of Riverside Studios.